Hi, and welcome to a session on linked arrays, parallel arrays. You will notice that in my PowerPoint I've indicated two arrays. One array is called names, which is storing the names of students. The second array is called marks, where your students' marks, the respective students' marks, are stored. And what is linking both the arrays? It's actually very simple. It's just the index number. If we look at position 3 in the names array, Zondi. If we look at position 3 in the marks array, 90. So we know that in position 3 we have Zondi's name and his respective mark. I want you to remember that even as we would program. Alright, coming into Delphi, you will notice that I've designed the GUI. I have a memo and I have 5 buttons. The first button is populate array. I'm going to double click on that array. And now we're going to write code behind this button. Going up, I've declared 2 arrays in my global section under var. The first one is called names, which will store the names of the students. We're dealing with 10 students. The second array is of type integer, will store their respective marks. And remember what we said is that your index positions will link the names and marks array. So coming down to the actual procedure, populate. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to run a loop. So for control space, and you'll see the for loop has been generated. So we're going to double click on that, and you'll notice I declared the variable I, which is of type integer, which is for my loop. So I is assigned. We're going to run it from 1 to 10 because we have 10 elements in our array. And what we want to do is we want to allow the user to enter 10 names. So I'm going to call for the names array, names of I is assigned, and I'm going to use the input box, INP, control space. The input box will come up, and we know for the input box we have 3 parameters. The first one is for the name or the title of the box. We're going to call it students. Doesn't matter what you call it at this stage. The second one is to give a user prompt message, so I'm going to say enter name, and the third one we're going to leave blank. Then we're going to populate the marks array, and I'm going to use the random function to do that. Marks of I is assigned, and the random function we're going to use with a range of 101, which will give us numbers from 0 to 100. So I've done that. The next thing we want to do is return to our GUI. And what is important after we populate the array, to display the contents of both arrays. So I'm going to double click on display, and you'll notice that if we come to display, once again I've declared the variable I, which is of type integer. We're going to run a for loop, for control space, and we're going to run it from 1 once again to 10. Take out the -1. Alright, and I'm using the memo area. We can use a begin and an end if you want to use one. And I've got a GUI called memo1, mem control space dot lines dot add, and I'm going to display the contents of names array. So it'll be names of I. And then I'm going to concatenate that, join that to the marks array, but I'm going to include a tab space in between. So hashtag 9 plus, and the second one is marks of I. Now you'll notice that if we try to run this program, we're going to have an error because marks is of type integer and we're trying to display it in a GUI called memo. So I've got to convert that. So I'm going to put a bracket around that, and I'm going to convert that to a string. And we know that to convert to string, it's int control space into string, and that will be able to achieve that. Very quickly, if we return to our GUI and we're going to run this, let's hope that it works. So the GUI comes up, populate array. I'm going to put in 10 names. I'm just going to use a letter for now. A, S, D, G, H. Doesn't matter what letters we enter, just to see it work. And if I click on display, you'll notice I have the 10 names and the marks. Okay, next we want to write a procedure that will search through the array, where the user will type in a name and it will find the student's corresponding mark. So I'm going to double click on search. As you can see, I've declared my variables. There's our search. The variable that I'll be using is item pos of type integer, search item which is of type string, and found which is of type boolean. So I will explain this as we go along. The first thing we're going to allow the user is to enter the name of a student whose marks they're trying to look for. So S, and I've got a variable called search item, or you could call it search name, is assigned, and I'm going to use the input box to be able to capture that name. And once again, 3 parameters, which we've done, and we want to tell the user we're going to give it a title called search name, and the user, we want a prompt message say enter student name, which we would do, and the third parameter we leave blank. Then we're going to run a loop, so it's for control space, and the loop once again is going to run from 1 to 10, and you'll notice that I'm using the variable called I, which is a local variable, and it is declared on the top as type integer. So for us to search, we run a loop from the position 1 to position 10. We're going to use the if statement, if, and we're checking if the contents of the names array at each position, and we're checking if it's actually equal to search, what the user has entered in the input box. So if the contents of the array at that position is equal to the search item, then what do we want to take place? Firstly, we want to output the student's mark. So I'm going to say memo dot lines dot add, and we have entered the name, so we want to now output their mark, which was stored in the marks array. And once again, marks array is of type integer, so we need to convert it to a string. So its function, or we are using is into string, and I need an extra bracket, and that caters for that. Also, I want to use the boolean field. If we find that, then we want to change. You see found, which is of type boolean. So we're going to say before we start our search, we'll assume that found is false. And the reason for this, what if a student does not exist in the array, is not in the array? So then I'm going to change my if statement and bring in a begin and an end. And now I'm going to say if they are equal, then I can change my found to be true, which means we actually found the student. And then I can make a statement after the for loop. I can now say if found is still equal to false, that means it did not change to true, then we don't have a student existing. So we'll say memo 1.lines dot add, and we can put a simple message is student not in the class, and hopefully that should work. So very quickly we're going to run the program, and you'll notice the GUI pops up. So we're going to say populate, and we're going to put in some students' names in this. I'm just going to use one letter because of time. You can type in whole names, and if we say display, and if we now click on search, let's assume we're looking for the student K, whose mark is 7. So if we enter K, we have 7 being outputted. We should actually put a nice message with that, and we can go back and say before the actual mark we could say students mark, and we can, I'm going to take the apostrophe out, students mark, and we can put a nice colon sign and then concatenate it to a hashtag 9, just for it to be a little more presentable and more meaningful to the user. And if we run that, get the GUI coming up again, populate array, and once again I'm going to enter some names, and for time I'm just using a letter. And if we say display, we have the names, the marks, and if we say search, let's assume we're looking for K again, which is 23, and we get the student's mark to be 23. Next, we're going to be looking at the next button, which is alphabetical in terms of sorting, and we want to sort the arrays. So very quickly, I'm going to double click on alphabetical just to make it more clear to you, get everything else off the screen. We're going to do a sort. Now, we have done a sort previously, and if you remember, in a sort we run two loops for control space, and the first loop should be running from 1 to the number of elements minus 1. In this case it's 9. And then we're going to have a begin. The second loop is going to run from, and I'm going to quickly do that just to indent it and make it look neat. Your second loop is going to run from, I've used two variables, I and k, so this first one is running from 1 to 9. The second loop is going to run from k, and we'll run it from I plus 1, which is the adjacent cell, I plus 1, and we'll run it to the total number of elements, and in this case the total number of elements in the array is 10. And we're going to put a begin in there. So we have a begin and an end just to neaten that up. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do a check. And the check we're going to be actually working with is we're going to check the adjacent cells, or we're going to compare the adjacent cells. So we're going to use an if statement, and we want to sort in alphabetical order. So very quickly we're going to say if names of I is greater than names of K, and you can notice that I is our first loop, K is our second loop. So we are comparing the cells. If it is greater, then we need to swap. And for us to be able to do a swap, we've done this in the last section where we're swapping two elements and we bring in a variable to temporary hold. And you'll notice that I should have a begin in there as well. It's quite untidy. I'm just going to neaten that up. So this allows us to swap the adjacent cells. So if it is greater, we're comparing the names. Then we're saying names of I, that's the first one, is assigned swap. And then we say names of I is assigned names of K, and names of K is assigned swap. And swap is a variable that I've declared of type string to temporarily hold one of the names. Now, the problem lies is because the arrays are linked, if we swap the names array and we have John in position 5 and we move John to position 1, the problem is if we move John, his mark is still in position 5, so we need to also swap the marks array. So we're going to write code to do that. And once again, we need to write our 3 lines of swap, and you notice that I'm using a new variable called swap1, which is of type integer, which will allow us to swap the marks array. And if we do that, that should automatically sort. We call this a parallel sort. And the reason why it's parallel, we are simultaneously sorting both the arrays. So this sort will sort the array names in alphabetical order, but at the same time it will swap the relevant or respective marks. So if we run this, and it'll be good for us to run it just to make sure for errors, and you'll notice I have some errors, and I think it's dealing with my begin and ends very quickly. I've got a begin and an end, begin and an end, begin and end, and I think I'm missing one end, so I'm going to quickly do that. Control D just to indent that, and if we run now, beautiful, the GUI comes up. So if we say populate, get our names, I'm just using letters for now because of time, and if I say display, you'll notice I have the names and the marks, and if I click on alphabetical, it should sort, and if I click on display again, we should see in alphabetical order. And you'll notice that if we look at B, it's 50. And if you look at in the other one, B, and quickly trace is also 50. So we're going to make it look a little neat. Alright. So what we can do in our program, we can automatically call, this method can call for the display. And how do we call for that button? We'll just say btn control space, and we can use the command display click, and in brackets action, which will call for that button, so we don't have to go and click. So after we sort, but maybe we could also go and clear the memo, because we could have something. So memo 1 dot, before our output comes up, we could clear that, and then we would have a better picture of what we want to do. Quickly, we're going to run this program, and I noticed that I picked up an error, and the button is not called button display. So very quickly we're going to change that, btn control space, and the button that we're trying to call, if we quickly trace up, the method is called display click. Can you see that? Button display click. So that's the one I need to call, button D, and we're looking for display click. And now if we run, beautiful, we have the GUI coming up. Populate, once again, get some letters in, and then we click on display, and we click on alphabetical, and you'll notice that it cleared the memo, and we have an alphabetical order with the corresponding marks. What I want you to do as your task is to program descending, where you would write a sort, where now we would sort according to the marks, the highest to lowest. Thank you.